Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Robert Service's cabin. My name is Tom Byrne, and I'm going to tell you a bit about the life of Robert Service, and I'll also give you some of his poems as we move along. First of all, Robert Service was born in England. He was born in a place called Preston, which is way up in the north of England. His father was Scottish and his mother was English. His mother came from a very well-to-do family. They had a woolen mills in Lancashire, and his father worked for the Bank of Scotland. Now, there was a large family of them. There was 10 of them in the family. And when Robert was a little child, he went to live with 3 of his aunts who lived in Scotland with his grandfather. Now, his grandfather ran a small post office, and the girls helped him run the business. None of the girls ever got married. They all remained single. But they did, however, help to bring up Robert Service during part of his early childhood. Well, now, the girls were very fond of reading. And as was the custom in those days, they would usually sit around the fireplace in the evenings, and they would take it in turns reading. And whenever they did so, they would always read out loudly. So I guess this is where Robert first got his introduction to literature, was listening to the girls read, because as he grew older, he developed a very keen interest in books himself. And amongst his favourites was Kipling, Tennyson, Browning, Robbie Burns, Shakespeare, and he was also very fond of Western novels. And amongst his favourite Western novelists was Bret Harte and Zane Grey. When he left school, he followed in his father's footsteps, and he took up a career in banking. He served 7 years apprenticeship with the Bank of Scotland, and after serving his apprenticeship, he got his papers and then decided he had quite enough of the banking business to last him for the rest of his life. He found it very boring and uninteresting. And he made up his mind he was coming out here to Canada to become, of all things, a cowboy. I guess this must have been the result of reading a lot of Western novels. His father rigged him out in an outfit which he purchased at an auction, very reasonable. And this consisted of a Spanish sombrero and high-heeled boots. And he also bought him a Harris tweed suit, a leather suitcase, a camera, and he also provided him with a gun. And away went Robert to seek his fame and his fortune in Canada. He left Liverpool on a tramp steamer, and he travelled steerage and came across the Atlantic Ocean and finally up to St. Lawrence, and he arrived in Montreal. And when he got to Montreal, all the money he had in his pocket was $5, not nearly enough money to take him across the country. So he sold most of his gear and equipment right there on the railway station in Montreal. And the first thing he got rid of was the Harris tweed suit, which his father had bought for him. He'd no use for that. And later he sold the suitcase and the camera, but he held on to the Spanish sombrero and the high-heel boots because he figured he was going to need these before very long. He came all the way across Canada to the west coast. He arrived in Vancouver, and he went across to Vancouver Island, where he got a job in a small ranch. Well, the first job they gave him was in a field picking stones, and then they put him weeding, and then the next thing he got was a job milking. Now, this was a long way from what he had been dreaming about, bronco busting. He became what he termed a cow juice jerker, and he hung in there cow juice jerking some time. Well, after working for some time there on Vancouver Island, he headed down into the States, all the way down into Seattle, and he was down by the waterfront. He was passing by a shipping office, and there was a sign outside of the shipping office which said, SS Mariposa leaving for San Francisco, $1. He went in to inquire, and sure enough, that's what the fare was, $1. They told him there was a price war going on at the present time, and if he left it for a few days, that the fares would all be back to normal. And of course, Robert, being a bit of a Scotsman, couldn't resist the bargain. He went aboard the Mariposa, and when he got aboard, he met up with a bunch of hobos who were all heading south. They were all taking advantage of the cheap fare. They were following the sun down south. He arrived in San Francisco and he worked at different jobs there and finally got a job tunneling. Then he moved further into California and he worked in the orange groves, washing oranges and later picking oranges. Well, one day he heard about a job which was going in San Diego. There was a woman looking for someone to teach her daughters etiquette and poise and give them some private tuition and culture. Robert figured this was just a job for him, so he went after it. And when he got to the address, it was a beautiful big house with a long driveway up to it, and he went up, knocked on the door. He said, "I've come here after the job you've been advertising." The woman brought him in, interviewed him, and he got the job. The only thing is, it turned out to be a very fashionable house of ill repute, and the so-called daughters were all ladies of the establishment. But that didn't worry Robert too much at all. He enjoyed that job for some reason or another. One of the girls had a guitar and he picked it up and he tuned it and he started playing the guitar. He was getting on very well there. He got on wonderful there with the girls, and then he got itchy feet and he decided it was time to move. The madam didn't like him having too much attention to the girls anyway, so it was time for him to go. They gave him a bit of a party and told him he could keep the guitar as a going away present, and from that day onwards he became a vagabond, a drifter and a hobo. And he mixed with the hobos, he learned all the tricks of the trade, and he'd travel up and down the country jumping off trains. And he would go to the nearest farmhouse and he'd play them a tune on the guitar, or he'd recite them a little bit of poetry in exchange for a meal. He used to recite Gunga Din, and he also recited The Face on the Barroom Floor. Now, a lot of people think that he wrote The Face on the Barroom Floor, but he didn't. It was written before his time. It was written during the days of the Colorado Gold Rush. But Robert was very fond of it, and he always used to recite it every opportunity he got. He lived that way for a long time, travelling up and down the country, from one state to the other. And one day he lost his guitar. He dropped it down a ravine. Now he was up a creek without a paddle. He couldn't sing for his supper anymore. And he had to return back and revert back to taking the odd job here and there to get money to pay for meals. Well, he drifted back up along the coast back to Vancouver and went back again once more to Vancouver Island, where he got a job working again on the ranch. And he stayed there for some time and came back again to Vancouver, where he applied for a job with the Bank of Commerce. He produced his papers to show that he had served 7 years apprenticeship with the Bank of Scotland. Of course, by this time, the papers were all in ribbons, the way he'd been living. But the manager of the bank was very patient, and he could piece it together, and he could see that he had indeed served his apprenticeship to the business of banking, so he took him on. He'd done very well at the bank. He got transferred from Vancouver to Victoria, and then he got transferred from Victoria to Kamloops. Now, he lived high on the hog when he got into Kamloops. He had saved up a bit of money by this time, and one of the first things he done was go out and get himself a horse, because Kamloops was all cowboy country. He finally got in some horseback riding without having any more worry about milking cows. Well, he worked there for some time. There was an exclusive club there which he joined, and they had a polo team, and he became a member on the polo team. And he had his photograph taken, dressed up in his polo outfit, sitting up on top of the horse. And he sent this photograph back to his parents in the old country to let them see how well wee Willie was doing out here in Canada. Well, after some time there, he got transferred again, and this time it was to the Yukon, to Whitehorse. He was very happy about this, because he'd been reading a lot about the North, and it was his intention to head up this way at the first favourable opportunity. Now fate had taken a turn, and here he was being sent up at the expense of the bank. They gave him $200. They told him to go out and get himself some winter clothing and whatever else he might require. And he went off on a big shopping spree, and he bought all sorts of things, including a coon coat. And he also got himself another guitar. Well, he wasn't long in Whitehorse before he became quite popular. He was always welcome at any parties or socials that were going on because he could do a little entertaining. Well, one day the editor of the Whitehorse Star came up to him and he said, "Robert, the church group are putting on a concert to raise funds for the church. Is there any chance of you helping them out?" "Sure," said Robert. "Put my name down there." He says, "I'll help them." "There's only one thing," said this guy. He said, "We've all heard you reciting Gunga Din and the face on the barroom floor. But what we've been wondering is, what is the chance of you sitting down and writing something yourself? Something about our part of the country. Something about the north." "Well," said Robert, "that's a very tall order, but I'll have a go." He went home that night. He was trying to figure out what he could write about, and he hadn't got a clue. That Saturday evening, he was walking down the main street in Whitehorse, and all of the singing, the music, the hollering, the shouting and excitement was all coming through the open doors of the bars. It was Saturday night, and it was pay night, and everyone was having a wonderful time. Robert stood on the corner for a few minutes listening to all this commotion, and finally said, "Gosh," he said, "they're having a great time tonight. The boys are all really whooping it up tonight." And then he carried on down the street to the bank. He figured that the bank would be the quietest place in town. He could sit down there without any noise or disruptions and dream up something for the coming concert. Well, when he got to the bank, he let himself in the back door, and as he did so, there happened to be a security guard on duty that night. And as soon as he heard the noise in the back room, immediately he assumed someone had broken into the bank. And he ran for his gun and took a couple of shots at the shadow that he seen crossing the floor in the back room. And thank God he was a terrible shot, or I wouldn't be telling you the story here today. The bullets went whizzing past his head. "My God," he said, "I figured this was going to be the quietest place in town, and I nearly had my head blown off." Well, he sat down there with the shots echoing through his head, and he commenced to write. All night long, right into the early hours of the morning, and finally, at about 5 o'clock in the morning, he put down his pen. He had accomplished what he had sat down to do, and he felt very satisfied with the results. And that, ladies and gentlemen, turned out to be The Shooting of Dangerous Dan McGrew, written in Whitehorse in the Bank of Commerce, and that's exactly the way it all began. Good. I wonder if you mind closing the gate for me, please. Keep out the bugs. Shooting of Dangerous Dan McGrew. A bunch of the boys were whooping it up in the Malamute Saloon. Handle the music box was playing a jagtime tune, and back in the bar in a solo game sat Dangerous Dan McGrew, and watching his luck was his light of love, the lady that's known as Lou. Well, from out of the night, which was 50 below, and into the din and the glare, there stumbled a miner fresh from the creek, dog dirty and loaded for bear. He looked like a man with one foot in the grave, and scarcely the strength of a louse, as he tilted his poke of dust on the bar, and he called for drinks for the house. Well, now there's none could place that stranger's face, though we searched ourselves for a clue, and we all drank his health, and the last one to drink was Dangerous Dan McGrew. Well, now there's men that'll just grip your eyes and hold them there like a spell. And such was he, and he looked to me like a man who had lived in hell, with a face most hair and a dreary stare of a dog whose day is done. He wore the green stuff in his glass, and the drops fell one by one. Then I got to figuring who he was, and wondering what he'd do. I turned my head, and there watching him was the lady that's known as Lou. Well, his eyes went rubbering around the room, and he seemed in a sort of a daze, when at last that old piano fell in the way of his wandering gaze. The ragtime kid was having a drink, and there was no one else on the stool, and the stranger he stumbled across the room, and he flopped down there like a fool. And in a buckskin shirt that was glazed with dirt, he sat, and I saw him sway. Then he gripped those keys in his taloned hands. My God, could that man play? Have you ever been out in the great unknown, and the moon was awfully clear, and the icy mountains hemmed you in with a silence that you most could hear? And only the howl of a timber wolf, and you camped there in the cold, a half-dead thing in a stark-dead world, clean mad for that muck called gold. While high overhead, green, yellow and red, the north lights swung in bars, well then you've got a hunch what the music meant. Hunger and night and the stars. And hunger not of the belly kind, that's banished with bacon and beans, but that awful hunger of a lonely man for a home and all that it means. For a fireside far from the cares that are, four walls and a roof above, and oh so crammed full of cosy joy, and crowned with a woman's love. A woman dearer than all the world, and true as the heaven is true. My gosh, how ghastly she looks through her rouge, that lady that's known as Lou. Then all of a sudden the music changed, so soft that you scarce could hear. And it seemed as if your life had been looted clean of all that you once held dear. That someone had stolen the woman you loved, and her love was a devil's lie. And the best thing for you to do was to crawl away and die. It was the crowning cry of a heart's despair, and it thrilled you through and through. I guess I'll make it a spread misere, said Dangerous Dan McGrew. Well, the music, it almost died away. Then it bust like a pent-up flood, and it seemed to say, repay, repay, and my eyes were blind with blood. A thought went back to an ancient wrong, and it stung like a frozen lash, and the lust awoke to kill, and then the music, it stopped with a crash. Well, now the stranger he turned, and his eyes they burned in a most peculiar way. And in a buckskin shirt that was glazed with dirt, he sat, and I saw him sway. Then his lips went in a kind of a grin, and he spoke, and his voice was calm. And boys, said he, you don't know me, and none of you care a damn. But I want to state, and my words are straight, and I'll bet my poke that it's true. One of you is a hound of hell, and that one is Dan McGrew. Well, I ducked my head, and the lights went out, and two guns blazed in the dark. A woman screamed, and then the lights came on, and two men lay stiff and stark. Pitched on his head and pumped full of lead was Dangerous Dan McGrew, while the stranger from the creek lay clutched to the breast of the lady that's known as Lou. Well, now these are the simple facts of the case. I guess I ought to know. They say that the stranger was crazed with hooch, and I ain't denying that so. I'm not as wise as you lawyer guys, but strictly between us two, the woman who kissed him and pinched his poke was that lady that's known as Lou. So that was the shooting of Dangerous Dan McGrew, written in Whitehorse in the Bank of Commerce. And would you believe that was written for a church concert? I don't know what he was thinking about. Maybe the fact that he nearly had his head blown off knocked everything out of it. I can assure you one thing, it was never aired at any church concert. They refused to have anything to do with it. However, he did recite it whenever he went to a party, and sometimes if he was in the bar having a couple of drinks and he was called upon to give a recitation, he'd always oblige. He'd get up and give them the shooting of dangerous Dan McGrew, and everybody loved it. Well, it was a few weeks after that, and he was at a party one night. And all of the guys, they were all coming in, they were all drifting in from the creeks, all the trappers and the miners. And they were all swapping yarns and tales and telling stories about the various things which had happened during the past season. Well, this big guy came in from Dawson City. He was a gold miner. And he was telling a story about how he cremated his buddy on the ice. Now, his buddy had come from Tennessee, and all the time he was here, he'd done nothing only moan and groan and complain about how cold it was. Nevertheless, he hung in right till the bitter end, until finally one day he kicked the bucket. And his friend and partner, as a last gesture of respect, cremated his remains on the ice. Robert liked the story, and the more he thought about it, the better he liked it. He went home that night. He couldn't get it out of his head. He kept thinking about this guy coming all the way from Tennessee, from one environment to another, and trying to imagine his feelings. How would he feel under similar circumstances if he was in that fellow's shoes? And the more he thought about it, the better he liked it. Then he began to think to himself, gosh, this is good material for a story. Next day he was in the bank, and he was sitting behind his desk working on the ledger. And it kept coming into his head about the story which he had heard the night before, when he glanced down, and there, staring him straight in the face right from the pages of the ledger he was working on, was the name Sam McGee. Sam McGee was a lumberman. He lived in Whitehorse, and he had an account with the Bank of Commerce. As soon as Robert spotted the name Sam McGee, immediately it rang a bell. Sam McGee, he said. Sam McGee. Well, now that rhymes beautiful with Tennessee. Sorry, Sam, he says, but I guess you're the guy we're going to burn. And that's where he got the name, right there in the bank out of the book. And that poor guy, Sam McGee, he had one heck of a job living that one down when it hit the streets in Whitehorse. But all turned out well in the end. They did become very good friends afterwards, and all was forgiven. But that's the way it was with Robert Service. A lot of stories he picked up here and there from the old-timers who had been through the early days of the gold rush. And almost everything he wrote about contains a certain amount of truth and fact, things that actually did happen. Of course, he did twist the stories around a little bit here and there to make them more interesting. Anyway, this is what happened with the cremation of Sam McGee. And those of you who have a video camera with you, if you wish to take it, go ahead and be my guest. Are we all set? Right? So this is the cremation of Sam McGee. There are strange things done in the midnight sun by the men who moil for gold. And the Arctic trails hold secret tales that'll make your blood run cold. And the northern lights have seen queer sights, but the queerest they ever did see was that night on the marge of Lake Labarge when I cremated Sam McGee. Well, now Sam McGee was from Tennessee, where the cotton blooms and blows. And why he left his home in the south to roam around the pole, God only knows. He was always cold, but the land of gold seemed to hold him like a spell, and he'd often say in his homely way that he would sooner live in hell. Well, now it was Christmas Day, and we were mushing our way over the Dawson Trail. Talk of your cold through our Parker's fold, it stabbed like a driven nail. And if our eyes we closed and our eyelashes froze, till sometimes we couldn't see. It wasn't much fun, but the only one to whimper was Sam McGee. That same night as we lay packed tight in our ropes beneath the snow, And the dogs were all fed, and the stars overhead, they were dancing heel and toe. He looked at me, and cap said he, I'll cash in this trip, I guess. And if I do, I'm asking you, now you'll not refuse my last request. Well, he seemed so low, I couldn't say no. And he said with a sort of a moan, it's that awful cold, it's got right hold, and it's chilled me right clean through to the bone. Now it ain't been dead, it's my awful dread of the icy grave that pains, and I want you to swear, foul or fair, that you'll cremate my last remains. Well, a pal's last need is a thing to heed, and I swore I wouldn't fail. And we hurried on at the streak of dawn. My God, he looked ghastly pale. He was crouched on the sleigh, and he raved all day of his home in Tennessee. And before nightfall, a corpse was all that was left of Sam McGee. Well, now there wasn't a breath in that land of death, as I hurried horror-ridden, with a corpse half hid that I couldn't get rid because of a promise given. It was lashed to the sleigh, and it seemed to say, you can tax your brawn and your brains, but you promised true, now it is up to you to cremate these last remains. Well, a promise made is a debt unpaid, and the trail has its own stern code. And in the days to come, though my lips were dumb, my God, how I cursed that load. And in the long lone nights by the lone fir light, and the huskies around in a ring, they howled out their woes to the homeless snows. My God, how I loathed that thing. Every day that quiet clay seemed heavy and heavier to grow, and on I went though the dogs were spent, and the grub was getting low. The trail was bad, and I was half mad, but I swore I'd not give in. I'd often sing to the hateful thing, and it would hearken with a grin. Then I came to the marge of Lake Labarge, and a derelict there lay, and I saw in a trice it was jammed in the ice, and it was called the Alice May. Well, I looked at it, and I thought a bit. Then I looked at my frozen chum. Then here said I, with a sudden cry, is my crematorium. Some planks I tore from the cabin floor, and I lit the boiler fire, and some coal I found that was lying all around, and I built the fuel on higher. The flames they soared, and the furnace roared, such a blaze you'll seldom see. Then I bored a hole in that glowing coal, and I stuffed in Sam McGee. Then I took a hike, because I didn't like to hear him sizzle so. And the heavens scowled, and the huskies howled, and the wind began to blow. It was icy cold, but the hot sweat rolled down my cheeks. I don't know why. And the greasy smoke in its inky cloak went streaking down the sky. Well, now I do not know how long in that snow I wrestled with grisly fear. But the stars came out, and they jumped all about ere I ventured near. I was sick with dread, but I bravely said, I'll just take a peek inside, because he must be cooked. And it's time I looked, and then the door I opened wide. And there sat Sam, looking cool and calm in the heart of the furnace roar. And he wore a smile that you could see a mile, and he said, oh, come on, will you please close the door? It's fine in here, but I gravely fear you're going to let in the cold and the storm. Since I left Plum Tree down in Tennessee, this is the first time that I've been warm. Well, now there are strange things done in the midnight sun by the men who moil for gold. And the Arctic trails hold secret tales that'll make your blood run cold. And the northern lights have seen queer sights, but the queerest they ever did see was that night on the marsh of Lake Labarge when I cremated Sam McGee. Well, That was another one which he used to recite whenever he went to a party, and sometimes he also recited in the bars whenever he was requested to do so, and everyone loved it. He wrote a bunch more while he was in Whitehorse, and it was coming up to Christmas, and he must have been doing a pretty good job at the bank because they gave him a bonus. They gave him $100 bonus. He figured he would put this money to good use. His father and mother had left the old country. They were now living back east. They were living in Toronto. So Robert gathered up this bunch of poems which he had written. They were all lying in a drawer, covered over with a couple of shirts. And he gathered up these poems and he sent them off together with the $100 which he had received from the bank, and he sent them back to his father back in Toronto. And he asked his father if he'd look around and see if he could find someone who would print up about 100 copies for him. He intended to send them back to the old country to friends and to relatives as gifts, as presents. But his father, God bless him, he took them to a publisher. And the publisher read them and he liked them, and the next thing that happened, Robert Service received a letter from the publisher asking his permission to publish his work. He said, "We look after all of the expenses, and in return we'll pay you 10% royalties on everything we sell." Robert Service was delighted. He hadn't expected this. It had come right out of the blue. He was overjoyed, and he sat down immediately and he wrote off a letter and he told them to go ahead and publish. They sent him back his $100 and they printed up 10,000 copies. And as soon as they hit the streets, they were whipped up like hotcakes. Here was poetry, here was stuff now that the ordinary layman could relate to. It was nice, easy reading, it was entertaining and enjoyable, and it also contained a certain amount of news about the North, which people were all hungry for in those days. And it came out in a little small leather-bound book, which was easy to drop into your breast pocket, or you could slip them into your purse. They were very convenient. Consequently, they became quite popular, and everyone was buying them. They printed up another batch. They sold just as quickly as the first batch. And they printed up yet another batch, and they also sold out. Within 2 years, there was over 20 editions of that little book of poems pushed out on the market. Now Robert Service was on the verge of a new career. He got transferred from Whitehorse over here to Dawson City, and he went to work for the branch of the Bank of Commerce, the same building which is sitting down there on the banks of the Yukon, right down on Front Street. And he went to work in there, and he lived in a little bunkhouse which was attached to the bank. Well, the money from the royalties began to roll in, more and more and more, and gradually his savings account began to swell and get larger, and it wasn't very long before he had accumulated a considerable amount of money in his savings. And one day he said to himself, he says, "Robert, what the heck are you doing here? Get out of here and do something useful with your life." He never really did care for the banking business. He always found it boring and uninteresting. It was just another job, a means to an end. And now that he had some money in his savings, he figured he could afford to take a chance and quit the job and devote all of his time and his energy just to writing. And that's exactly what he done. He handed in his notice and he quit the bank. And when he quit the bank, he had to get out of the bunkhouse because it went with the job. And he walked all around Dawson City looking for somewhere to live. And finally he came up here to 8th Avenue and he found this little cabin sitting here empty. He hunted around looking for the owner, and after some time he located the person who owned it. It belonged to a woman named Clark, Mrs. Edna Clark. He found Mrs. Clark, he made a deal with her, and he moved in here. And this is where he was to turn out so much of the works about the North, which we are all so very familiar with today. Right here, in this little cabin, he turned out an enormous amount of work. Robert Service never went out to the creeks looking for gold, but he found gold. He found lots and lots of gold. And he found gold in the beauty of the North, in its majestic mountains, in its deep valleys, and its fast-running rivers, and the people that he met, and all of their trials and the tribulations and the hardships that they all suffered and endured, and he jotted it all down on paper, which we now can enjoy. And in the course of doing so, he became rich and famous while he lived here in Dawson City. Robert Service talked about the spell of the Yukon. And those of you who have come through the Yukon or Alaska, it's all the same fabulous, fantastic country, you will have an idea what he means when he talks about the spell. Because there is something about the North that does indeed cast a spell on nearly everyone that comes here. It's uncanny the effect that the North has on people. Almost everyone who comes to the North for a visit usually return. There's some magic about the North. There's something mysterious about it. There's something about it that really gets a grip on your soul. We get away from the cement jungles, and here we are going through ground and looking upon places where man has never put foot on before. It's just the way it was when God first made it. And as we drift through the wilderness, surrounded by emptiness and loneliness and peace and quiet and serenity and living things, it reawakens something which is buried deep down within all of us, and it reminds us of what life is all about. Because we are all part of this, it's all part of nature. And of course this is also part of the spell. And this is the way Robert Service felt about the North. And of course it is also the way I feel about it. Robert Service went off and he put it all down on paper, and he called it the spell of the Yukon. So ladies and gentlemen, this is the spell of the Yukon as written by Robert Service. I came for the gold and I sought it. I scrabbled and I mucked like a slave. Was it scurvy or famine? I fought it. I hurled my youth into the grave. I came for the gold and I got it. I came out with a fortune last fall, but somehow life's not what I thought it, and somehow the gold isn't all. No, there's the land. Have you seen it? It's the cussedest land that I know. From the big dizzy mountains that screen it, to the deep death-like valleys below. Some say God was tired when he made it. Some say it's a good land to shun. But there are others who would trade it for no land on earth. And I'm one. You come to get rich? Damn good reason. You feel like an exile at first. You hate it like hell for a season, and then you are worse than the worst. It grips you like some kind of sinning, and it turns you from foe to a friend. It seems it's been from the beginning, it seems it will be to the end. I've stood at the mouth of a mighty hollow that was plumb full of hush to the brim. And I've watched the big husky sun wallow in crimson and in gold and grow dim, till the moon set the pearly peaks gleaming and the stars tumbled out neck on crop, and I thought I surely was dreaming with the peace of the world piled on top. The summer no sweeter was ever, the sunshiny slopes all a-thrill, the grayling a-leap on the river, and the bighorn asleep on the hill. The big land that has never known harness, and the wilds where the caribou call, the freshness, the freedom, the fairness. My God, how I'm stuck on it all. And the winter, the brightness that blinds you, and the big land locked tight as a drum, and the cold fear that follows and finds you, and the silence that bludgeons you dumb. There are snows that are older than history, and woods where the weird shadows slant. The coolness, the moonlight, the mystery. I've bade them goodbye, but I can't. There's a land where the mountains are nameless and the rivers all run God knows where. There are lives that are erring and aimless, and there are deaths that just hang by a hair. There are hardships that nobody reckons. There are valleys unpeopled and still. There's a land, oh, it beckons and it beckons. And I want to go back. And I will. Now they're making my money diminish, and I'm sick of the taste of champagne. Thank God when I'm skinned to a finish, I'll pike to the Yukon again. I'll fight, and you'll bet it's no sham fight. It's hell, but I've been there before, and it's better than this by a damn sight. So it's me for the Yukon once more. There's the gold, and it's haunting and haunting, and it's luring me on as of old. Yet it isn't the gold that I'm wanting, as much as just finding the gold. There's that great big land way up yonder, and the forests where silence has lease. It's the beauty that fills me with wonder, and it's the stillness that thrills me with peace. So that was the spell of the Yukon, and I'm sure some of you already have a bit of the spell. If you haven't, I can guarantee by the time you leave the north you will carry away part of the spell in your heart. It's inevitable. It happens to almost everyone that comes here. The story I'm going to tell you now, it's called The Quitter. And even though the words of this story are all related to the north, they can be applied to everyday living. Every day of our lives we run into problems and situations. Some are small, some are large, some are trivial. They come in all shapes, sizes and forms. And what do? We always tend to back off, to give in, to throw in the sponge and to quit. The worst possible thing you can do is quit. Because once you quit, you have admitted defeat. Now, no matter how hopeless the situation may seem at the time, whether it be sickness or whatever the problem is, never ever give up hope and never despair, and above all, don't quit. Always remember there is nothing like the power of positive thinking. It is a power which we all possess, each and every one of us. Unfortunately, we don't take advantage of it. We always take the easy way out, and we allow our bodies to take control of the situation instead of remembering to keep our mind in full control at all times. And once we do that, we are lost. We are finished. We've had it, and we don't get another chance. We must always remember one thing: the mind is the boss, and mind will always prevail over matter. And this has been proven time and time again. It really does work. And that's what the words of this little story is all about. It's called The Quitter. So the next time you're up against it and you feel like giving in and saying, oh, I can't be bothered, what's the use of fighting it, I don't stand a chance, that is your body playing tricks on you. Get a grip on yourself, put your mind back in control, and remember the words of the quitter. This is the way it goes. When you're lost in the wild and you're scared as a child, and death looks you bang in the eye, and you're as sore as a boil, it's according to Hoyle to cock your revolver and die. But the code of a man says live all you can, and self-disillusion is barred. In hunger and woe it's dead easy to blow. It's the hell served for breakfast that's hard. You're sick of the game? Well, now that's a shame. You're young and you're brave and you're bright. You've had a raw deal, I know, but don't squeal. Buck up and do your damnedest and fight, because it's the plodding away that'll win you today. So don't be a piker, old pard. Just draw on your grit. It's dead easy to quit. It's the keeping your chin up that's hard. Oh, it's easy to cry that you're beaten and die. It's easy to crawfish and crawl, but to fight and to fight when hope's out of sight, why, that's the best game of it all. And though you come out of each grueling bout all broken and beaten and scarred, just have one more try. It's dead easy to die. It's the keeping on living that's hard. Talking about living, this story is about an old sourdough who died and he went to heaven. Now don't look so surprised, because some sourdoughs do get to heaven. This fella got to heaven, and this is what happened when he got there. A sourdough came to stake a claim in heaven one morning early. And St. Peter cried, "Who waits outside them gates so bright and pearly?" "I'm recent dead," the sourdough said, "and I crave to visit Hades, where happily pine some friends of mine, including certain ladies." Says Peter, "Go, you old sourdough, from earth so cruelly riven, and if you fail to find their trail, well, we'll have a snoop round heaven." He waved, and lo, that old sourdough fell down to hell's red spaces, and though it was hot, he failed to spot those old familiar faces. The bedrock burned, and the sourdough turned, and he climbed with footsteps fleeter the stairway straight to heaven's gate, and there, of course, was Peter. "I cannot find my friends," he cried, "amongst those damned forever, but I've a hunch some of that bunch in heaven I'll discover." Said Peter, "True, and this I'll do, since sourdoughs are my failing. You see that bunch in paradise lined up against the railing, as bald as coots in birthday suits and with beards below their middle? Well, I will let you in right now if you can solve a riddle. Amongst that bunch of codgers who dodder round the portals is one whose name is known to fame. It's Adam, the first of mortals, and for quiet's sake he takes a break from Eve, who is his madam. Well, now there's the gate, to crash it straight, just spy the guy that's Adam." Well, the old sourdough went down that row of greybeards ruminating, and with optics dim they peered at him, and they pressed against the grating. And in every face he sought some trace of our ancestral father, and though he stared, he soon despaired the faintest clue to gather. Then suddenly he whooped with glee. "Ha ha! An inspiration!" And up and down the row he ran with animation, and to Peter bold he cried, "Behold, all told there are 11. Well, now suppose I fix on number 6. Say, boy, how is that for heaven?" "By gosh, you win," said Pete. "Step in. But tell me how you choose them. They're like as pins, all could be twins. There's nothing to disclose them." Well, the sourdough said, "It's true my head was seething with commotion. I felt a dunce, then all at once I got a sudden notion. I stooped and peered beneath each beard that hangs like fleece of mutton. My search was crowned. That bird I found ain't got no belly button." Now you know what to do when you get to the pearly gates. Keep your eyes open for the guys with the long white beards. And if you are tempted to go peeking behind their beards, please don't mention my name, or they'll never let me in. The story I'm going to tell you now has nothing at all to do with the North, but I'm going to give it to you because Robert Service wrote it. It's about an English lady. Actually, she came from Lancashire, and her name was Bessie. And this poor woman, God help her, she had a boil in a very unfortunate place. It's a very sad story. And if you'll all just bear with me just for a few minutes, I'll tell you all the story about Bessie's boil. Says I to me, missus, by gum lass, you have something I see on your mind. Says she, I have, Sam, I have, and it happens it's on my behind. I've got a boil that would make Job be jealous, and it hurts me no end when I sit. Said I, well, go to the hospital, missus. They might have to cut it a bit. Says she, oh, I just hate to be showing the part of me person it's at. Says I, don't be fussy. Should them doctors have seen far more horrid sights than that? Well, missus goes off togged up and tasty, and there at the hospital door they tell her to see the house doctor, whose office is at room 34. Well, she hunts up and down till she finds it, and she knocks, and a voice says, come in. And there is a handsome young fella in white from his heels to his chin. I got a big boil, says my Bessie, and it hurts me for fair when I sit. And Sam, that's my husband, he's asked me to ask you to cut it a bit. So blushing she picks up the courage and bravely she shows him the place, and he gives it a proper inspection with a heap of surprise on his face. And then he says with an accent of Scotland, what you have is a boil I can feel, but you better consult the head doctor. They call him Professor O'Neill. He's special for boils and carbuncles, and you'll find him in room 53. Ah, sure, there's no charge, missus. Sure, it's been a real pleasure. You just tell him that you're coming from me. Well, now, missus, she thanks him politely and she hunts up and down as before till she comes to a big handsome room with Professor O'Neill on the door. And once more she plucks up the courage and she knocks, and a voice says, all right. And she enters, and there is a fat fellow with whiskers, and he too is all dressed up in white. I got a big boil, says my Bessie, and if you are sure you don't mind, I'd like to have you inspect it. It hurts because it's behind. So blushing as red as a beetroot, she hastens to show him the spot, and he looks at it in amazement, and he says, oh, gee, ma'am, it must hurt you a lot. And he puts on his specs to regard it. And then finally he says with a frown, I bet it's as sore as the devil, especially when you sit down. But I think it's a case for the surgeon. You'd better consult Dr. Hoyle. And I've no hesitation in saying your boil is one hell of a boil. Well, now, Bessie, she thanks him for saying that her boil is a hell of a boil, and she hunts up and down till she comes to the room marked Dr. Hoyle. Well, by now she's fair got the wind up, and she trembles in every limb. But she thinks, after all, he's a doctor. I mustn't be bashful with him. Oh, she's made of good stuff, is my Bessie. So she knocks, and a voice says, who's there? It's me, says my Bessie, and she enters a room that's all spacious and bare. And a wise-looking old fella, he greets her. And he too is all dressed up in white. It's the room where they cut you, thinks Bessie, and she shakes like a jelly with fright. But thinking she best get it over, she hastens to show him the place. And he looks at her, kind of surprised like. And he gets very red in the face. But he looks at it most conscientious, from every angle of view. And then he says with a shrug of his shoulders, poor lady, I'm sorry for you. It wants to be cut. But you should have one of them medical blokes do that. So why don't you go down to the hospital where all the doctors is at? You see, ma'am, this part of the building, it's closed on account of repairs. And us fellas, well, we're only the painters. We're painting the halls and the stairs. Poor Bessie, God love her. I told you it was a sad story. Anyway, Robert Service continued writing, and he loved going for walks along the banks of the Yukon River and the Klondike River, always thinking and dreaming about something to write about. In the winter, he'd put on his snowshoes and he'd go for walks off up into the hills, forever dreaming. He was a great dreamer. Once he got an idea into his head, he just wouldn't let go. He'd come back here to the cabin and he'd lock himself away for hours and hours on end, and he wouldn't leave until he had completed what he had sat down to do. Inside of the cabin, he had the walls all wallpapered. He also had wallpaper on the ceiling. And he used to scribble bits and pieces of poems all around the walls and the ceiling. Everywhere in sight there was bits and pieces of poetry. And he also scribbled mottos and slogans. And one such motto said, "Don't worry, just work." And then there was another one which said, "Rebuffs are only rungs in the ladder to success." And these are some of the things he had scribbled around the walls inside of the cabin. He also collected old calendars which he got up from the States, and these calendars, they usually had nice pretty pictures on them, and he had them hanging from the ceiling all the way around the inside of the cabin. Now that is the way he lived. The method he used in his work, he would get a roll of white wallpaper and he would tear off a large chunk from the roll and he'd pin it to the wall inside of the cabin. Then he'd get a piece of charcoal and he would do the lettering 2.5 to 3 inches large. He would then stand back at the far end of the room and he'd read it out loudly over and over again, and it had to balance to the eye as well as to the ear before he was satisfied. And when he got it right and he figured it was perfect, he would then sit down inside of the cabin by that window on the left-hand side of the cabin. That is where he'd done all of his writing, right by that window. He had a little tiny typewriter. He would sit there and he'd tap it out, copying it from the pages which he had pinned to the wall around the inside of the cabin. And that is the way he lived, and that is the way he worked. And he loved this little cabin dearly. To him, the cabin was just like family. It was part of him. And he figured that he owed much of his success to the inspiration that he received here in the little cabin and its surroundings. The year was 1912 and the Balkan War was on at this time. Robert Service got a letter from one of the newspapers back east. They asked him if he would consider taking on the assignment of war correspondent. Robert thought about this for a while. He figured, well, maybe it mightn't be a bad idea to get away from here for a while and do something a bit different. It would be a change of pace. So after giving the matter some thought, he decided to take them up on their offer and accept the job and go overseas. He had intended to go out and pay a visit to his publisher anyway, so he figured he would kill 2 birds with the one stone. He started to pack some of his belongings into his suitcase. He was getting prepared to leave, when suddenly he became very sad. He hated leaving the little cabin. It was just as if he was being separated from a very close family member. And in his sadness he sat down and he wrote this little poem especially to his cabin. And as it turned out, it happened to be the last one he ever wrote here in the cabin, because this he never did get back. So ladies and gentlemen, this is the little poem which Robert Service wrote to his cabin before he left. Oh dear little cabin, I've loved you so long, and now I must bid you goodbye. I filled you with laughter, I thrilled you with song, sometimes I wished I could cry. Your walls have witnessed a weariful fight, yet rung to a one Waterloo. But oh, in my triumph, I'm dreary tonight. Goodbye, little cabin, to you. Your roof is bewhiskered, your floor is aslant, your walls seem to sag and to swing. I'm trying to point out your faults, but I can't, you poor, tired, broken-hearted old thing. Oft times you have been the best friend that I've had, your lamp like a gem in the snow. You're sort of a part of me, Gee, but I'm sad. I hate little cabin to go. Beneath your cracked window red raspberries climb, a hornet's nest hangs from a beam. Your rafters are scribbled with adage and rhymes and dimmed with tobacco and dreams. Each day has its laugh. Don't worry, just work. Such mottos reproachfully shine. Old calendars jangle. What memories lurk within you, old cabin of mine? I hear the world cry in the clang of the fight. I hear the hoarse cry of my kind. Yet well do I know as I quit you tonight that it's youth that I'm leaving behind. And often I'll think of you, empty and black, and your moose antlers nailed over the door. And if I should perish, my ghost will come back to dwell in your cabin once more. How still, sad and lonely, how dreary you seem. One last listful look, and I'll go. Will you remember the lad and his dreams, the lad that you comforted so? The shadows enfold you, and it's drawing tonight, and the evening star needles the sky. But oh, how it's stinging and stabbing my sight. God bless you, little cabin. Goodbye.